Hi guys. Some of you might be linked to this video, some of you might click through to this video and know who I am already. But today I want to talk about WoW's approach to rewards philosophy and gearing, and how gearing can be interesting and interactive, and what makes you care about gearing. So who am I? My name's Guiltyas. Some of you might know who I am further, some of you might not. I'm a WoWhead guide writer. I write the Feral Druid guide. I raid in the top hundreds, top 120 sort of range. Obviously, I play Feral Druid. I stream occasionally. You might know me from being slightly aggy on Twitter. We might even have argued about something silly in the past. What I want to talk about today is WoW's approach to gearing and how WoW approaches rewards in general. Obviously, the most common reward in the game, and part of why people play the game, is gear, is increasing throughput, is all of that, is getting stronger. It's an MMO. At the end of the day, the core fantasy of MMOs is gaining strength. And I think there are some issues with how WoW has viewed gearing and gaining strength and rewards in the last couple of expansions. And I really want to discuss what those issues are and why things might have been better in the past, and how can we improve and how can we get better. So what makes gear engaging? What makes you care about gear? There are a couple of reasons why you might care about gear. It might just be because it makes you do more damage and you want to be top of the meters, and that's fine. It might be because it looks cool, because it has a cool transmog, because anything like that, visual reasons, roleplay reasons. So you might care about gear because of the lore, because of what it means in the wider scope of Warcraft. And that's fine. That's completely fine. But from the perspective of a high-end raider, from the perspective of a competitive player, I really want to approach what makes me care about gear and what I feel most people care about gear, even if they haven't really thought about it and put it into words. I think these are the most important factors. So the number one thing for me is, how does a gear interact with my character? At the end of the day, we're all extremely attached to our characters, right? Our characters, well, this is going to sound a bit soppy, but our characters are us, and people might play multiple characters, but at the end of the day, the way we present ourselves in World of Warcraft is our character. Every piece of content that we do, be it Mythic Plus, be it transmog, be it roleplay, be it just standing around looking cool, it's all presented via the lens of our character. So I think for me the most important factor is, how does gear interact with that character? So a big part of this is how gear changes how you play or think about playing, or think about how you gear. So there are a variety of ways this is approached, be it stats like crit and haste for some specs, which really drive home, and having more of those stats actually changes your rotation, makes you play differently. I think that's a huge part of why those stats are successful and loved compared to something like mastery or versatility, which at the end of the day, a lot of time mastery or versatility is just, it's bland. It just increases the damage you do. It doesn't really change how you think about the game, or how you approach the game, or how you play the game. If I have more mastery, I do more damage, and I show up higher in the meters, and that's great. I do love showing high up in the meters, but it doesn't change the game for me in the way that crit and haste do for some specs. And there have been ways in the past where these have been more impactful. So things like haste breakpoints, or crit caps, or anything like that, where having a certain amount of a stat changes how you think about the rest of the gear. And a big part of the game for me is the puzzle of gearing. I'm given all these separate pieces. How can I put them together in the best possible way to maximize my throughput? That is what I love thinking about in this game. It's why I got into guide writing. It's why I got into theory crafting. It's the puzzle to solve of maximizing yourself. There's other ways that gearing has been interactive in the past. So snapshotting, obviously I play Feral Druid, so snapshotting is a beloved artifact of gameplay that I miss sorely. But to go more deeply into it, it really made you think more about pieces of gear. When I got a trinket that gave me stats then compared to now, when I used it or when I got that proc, It made me think about what I was doing and what I should do differently with that proc. Whereas now, I've kind of just gotten a proc and just do more damage for that period of time. There's no interaction with my character or how I think or how I'm playing. And I think that's something that's sorely missing. And of course, I'm a little bit biased here, but I do think this was something that getting rid of hurt the game. Another thing, more recently than snapshotting, obviously snapshotting was moved in Warlords going into Warlords Draenor for the most part, but whitelisting, or to use the more acceptable term nowadays, is allow listing. I'll use both terms just to make sure people understand what I mean, but for those of you who don't fully know what I'm talking about, it used to be, as recently as Legion, that trinkets and various abilities scaled with your class abilities. So say, I'll use the example of a Feral Druid. Obviously I play Feral Druid, so that's the easiest example for me. But Tiger's Fury, for those who don't know, it's a 30-second cooldown, and it increases your damage by 8% for 6 seconds or so. In Legion, you'd care about those 6 seconds, because it'd be a window where you could pop your unused trinket, if we're using trinkets from this tier as an example, Skulker's Wing or Dreadfire Vessel. You could use those during Tiger's Fury, and they'd do more damage. You'd care about the time of your abilities in order to maximize your output, and it made you think about what buttons you're pressing more so. It also changed what trinkets were good for some specs. So Enhancement Shaman Mastery, for example, it increases nature damage, fire damage, frost damage. Potentially trinkets that did those damage types would be better for those specs. And I think it's hugely beneficial to the game that not everybody wants the same pieces of loot. So I think this was something that was sorely missing going forwards from Legion. Talking's a bit tiring. Going further into this, WoW currently has a very seasonal approach to gearing. And when I say seasonal, I mean in between tiers are essentially new games. You replace all of your gear. And there are pluses and minuses to this. In games like Path of Exile and Diablo, this works really well. Each season, you start a new character, you gear it up, you get to the end game, you progress to the end game, and the next season it resets. It's a really good way of extending content. And you can see this in WoW with Mythic Plus in each new tier. Each Mythic Plus season is very similar to a Diablo season or a Path of Exile season. There's a gear reset. You basically all start from 0 again, and you gear up again. Everything is replaced. I think that while this system has some benefits, it also has some significant downsides in a game like WoW. Because WoW is an MMO, okay? And this causes an issue with evergreen loot. So what do I mean by evergreen loot? It's stuff that's the same every tier. I'm sure most of you will see one of these trinkets on this page, and you'll think, I farmed that last tier. File of Putrefaction, Inscrutable Quantum Device, Soul-Letting Ruby, Blood-Spattered Scale for the tanks out there. You farmed these trinkets last tier. You're going to farm them, or you have already farmed them this tier. You're going to farm them next tier. It just keeps going. This is THD. This poor sod. This is a demon hunter that I found. So why is seasonal loot an issue? So evergreen loot, it's an issue because you feel like it simplifies the gearing puzzle. So rather than each tier, the gearing puzzle is, these are the pieces of gear I'm being given from the raid. How do I fit these together in order to maximize output? And this does still happen somewhat. Sanctum of Domination's done a really good job with some of the on-use and active weapons, because they do break that puzzle of gearing. Obviously, again, I'm talking from the perspective of Feral Druid, but the polearm from the 9, Jotungaya, Destiny's Call, does a really good job of changing what we want, and that's really positive. They should absolutely do more of that. But that doesn't cover everyone. That's really maybe 2 specs across the game. So while that's positive, it does need to be approached more, because frankly, it's tiring. People have farmed Cube or Soulet and Ruby or File. This will be their like 3rd time of farming it, and it's miserable. It reduces the puzzle of gearing and thinking about what pieces you want into, this is my best gear, how does this new tier gear fit into that best gear, rather than the opposite way around. Instead of solving a brand new puzzle each time, you're just given a few new pieces and you're asked to fit those new pieces into your existing puzzle. So why is this an issue? I've kind of approached it a little bit. But why is seasonal gearing as a whole an issue? And the serious main part is character attachment. I mentioned before that really we all view this game through the perspective of our characters. Our characters just are us. When I play Path of Exile or Diablo A New Season, I can easily reroll a new character. I can play new abilities. There's buffs and there's nerfs to skills and sets, and the puzzle is different, and it's easy to make the puzzle different, and it's easy to make my lens through which I'm viewing the puzzle different. But in WoW, that's not the case. There's so much stuff you have to do, and chores you have to do to get a character raid ready and prepared. And at the end of the day, we're all attached to our characters. Some people will have played the same character for the last decade. It's not a reasonable suggestion for them to abandon that decade's worth of attachment in order to improve the issue of evergreen loot, in order to get more out of that game each patch. This is an issue that's really existed since Legion, and it kind of got a bit of a pass in Legion because it was new. It was a new issue. We've now had this same issue for three expansions, and especially with Azerite last expansion, it was more noticeable than ever. Every tier I had to farm out the new materials in order to buy my best Azerite piece that was the best last tier, that was the best the tier beforehand. And with the balancing that's done, like, this wouldn't be an issue if trinkets were actively balanced in between tiers. So last year I wanted Cube, that's great. If Cube was changed or a new trinket was added that was good, and I didn't still want Cube, I wasn't still hunting Cube, then that'd be great, it would be a breath of fresh air. But that isn't the case. So borrowed power. How does borrowed power affect gearing? What's good examples of borrowed power? Because I know people are looking at this and they're going, borrowed power is bad. But borrowed power is a broad description. At the end of the day, all of your gear is borrowed power. So why is some borrowed power acceptable and positive and even liked or viewed positively? And why is some bad? So what's borrowed power that's done wrong? Azerite. So Azerite had a load of issues. Firstly, it had the evergreen gear issue, which I mentioned beforehand, but it also wasn't particularly interactive. And that's not completely fair, because there were some Azerite traits that were really good. And there were some Azerite traits that just weren't. What was good and what was bad was very similar. So to use an example, Arms Warrior's Test of Might. It gave them primary stat based on what they'd done during their Colossus Smash window, if I remember correctly. So it changed how you played because you wanted to maximize what you got out of your Colossus Smash window. It changed how you thought about gear because the more haste you have, the more primary stat you could get, because the more you could do in your Colossus Smash window. To contrast that with a very similar trait, Jungle Fury. Jungle Fury was a fair Azerite trait where when you pressed Tiger's Fury, you got a load of crit. The difference between it and Test of Might is that Test of Might was interactive with your character. It changed what you wanted to do. It changed what stats you wanted. It changed how you thought about the game. Jungle Fury was press button and get stats. It was... While getting stats is more positive than a lot of the other Azerite traits. So this is a little bit not fair, because Jungle Fury was in the upper quartile of what was a good Azerite trait in terms of borrowed power done okay. But at the end of the day, it was still fairly dull and it was still fairly uninteractive. Test of Might was the same concept done superbly well. And there were other Azerite traits that did a similar thing, but those are some examples. Domination sets is another example of borrowed power that was done wrong. It's the current gearing system, so a lot of people will have their own pet peeves with it, will have their own issues, and will know what is frustrating about the gearing system. But to cover it quickly, it's uninspiring, it's uninteractive, it doesn't interact with our class or our spec or make us think about the gearing puzzle. If anything, it massively simplifies the gearing puzzle, because you go from having 6 to 7 pieces for 4 or 5 year slots to 1 piece. It limits legendary slots, so that further simplifies the gearing puzzle. It's really the antithesis of what borrowed power should be, and it's a prime example of how not to do borrowed power, of how borrowed power fails. So I won't harp on domination sets too much. Everybody knows the issues with them. They try to be tier sets, but they're not. So what is borrowed power that is successful? What is borrowed power that does it right? Artifact weapons. These are so close to being a fantastic example of borrowed power and just barely missed the mark. And to be clear, I'm talking about base artifact weapons here. Netherlight Crucible is exactly what was wrong with borrowed power across the whole. Netherlight Crucible was an awesome system. But the base of artifact weapons we were given, and the expansion upon artifact weapons that happened later on in the expansion, was fantastic. It was the closest we've gotten since Blizzard attempted to reinvent the wheel to borrowed power that really hit the nail on the head. It was specific to people's spec, it was specific to people's class. And people care a lot about the spec they play. They care more about the character they play, but for a lot of people, their spec is as much part of their character as anything else. People are feral druids, or they're fire mages, or they're sub-rogues, or they're BM hunters. So let's go a bit further into artifact weapons. Obviously, this was the feral druid artifact weapon. And some of these traits were fairly boring. Some of them were stuff like increased rake damage, increased damage during berserk, increased rip damage, increased swipe damage. But there are a lot of traits across the game that were more than that. There was stuff like Ashamane's energy, protection of Ashamane. All of these that are showing up on the screen right now are fantastic examples of traits that improved the game, that improved the class, that made you think about things in a new way, that interacted with what you were doing, and made the gearing puzzle more interesting, made the puzzle different. Conduits. Conduits are another example that are so close. In a lot of ways, some of the conduits are similar to the best of the artifact traits. Things like Ursoc's Endurance, which gives you a load of health and armor when you go into bear form, is so similar to Protection of Ashamane, which gave you dodge when you left cat form, and make you think about buttons in different ways. Things like Taste for Blood for Feral Druid, which the more bleeds you have on a target, the more damage your bite does. And going across other specs, there are a lot of conduits that hit the nail on the head. Conduits, of course, have their own issue in that they're connected to covenants and they're connected to soulbinds. And some of the conduits aren't very interesting. Some of the conduits aren't great. But this is the only main issue with conduits that I can see. I've given you 3 images here of my soulbind setups for 3 different specs. Can you guess which of these specs is what? You can't. There's no way you can. Because it's the exact same. Because that is the core of the issue with conduits and with soulbinds. With conduits, is that they're connected to the soulbind system, which is a mess. Because it punishes you for playing different specs. I know I've said people care about what spec they are. But at the end of the day, people do want the ability to play other specs. And when they do play these other specs, they don't want to feel like a second-class citizen because it's not their main spec. So going on. So Blizzard have done borrowed power well before, and they've nailed it on the head, and they've hit seasonal gear, and they combined those. So what is that? Tier sets. Tier sets are the best example of both borrowed power and seasonal gearing done to a T. In the past, when a new tier came along, you had a new tier set to go along with that tier, and that tier potentially changed how you played. It changed how you thought about the game, it changed how you thought about your spec. And it was only there for the season, but that was fine, because the next season you got something else. And some seasons you lost out, and some seasons you gained, but it was always something new and something different. The best of the tier sets changed how you played the game. They made you use different abilities. They changed what talents were good. They kept the game refreshed, going season to season or tier to tier. And back then it wasn't really considered seasons, but a tier was essentially the same as a season. It was a gear refresh. And you can go all the way back to Classic and TBC and Wrath Lich King even, and look at, the game wasn't so seasonal back then. You didn't replace everything each season. You might get something from the first raid that lasted you until the end of the expansion. Look at the Burning Crusade and Dragonspine Trophy. There's classic items like that. But that's not modern WoW. And people love that version of WoW, and they're entitled to love that version of WoW. But it was, at the end of the day, it was a very different game to what we play now. And tier sets are really the soul of borrowed power and seasonal gearing, because they're spec specific. They change your spec. They change what you play. They're borrowed power. And I know people hate borrowed power. The borrowed power term is really polarizing. But at the end of the day, tier sets are borrowed power. What's the difference between tier sets and legendaries or things like that, or Azerite armor? The difference is that it keeps the game fresh because it's constantly changing. A huge issue with Azerite armor was you had the same thing the entire expansion. I think there was a lot of promise with Azerite armor, but it was just mis-executed. If you got different traits each tier that were spec specific and changed how you played, then Azerite armor would have been very similar to tier sets. But they failed on that. So going back, tier sets are borrowed power done perfectly. It makes you think about your character, it makes you think about the gearing puzzle, it makes you think about the talent puzzle. I cannot harp on enough, but tier sets are so different from domination sets. Domination sets, they're convoluted. You need both the pieces, you need gems, then you need to upgrade those gems in order to maximize the set. So I've got a rank 4 Unholy set. That's great. Frost and Blood set might as well not exist because I've got a month's worth of investment into Unholy. So even if I wanted to try them out and see how they played, A, they don't play any differently. They play the exact same. But I'd have to invest so much time into getting them up to the same level. If I had a tier set, it was the same whether I had it on LFR or normal or heroic or mythic or whatever difficulty you wanted it to be. So tier sets are really the epitome of what I'm talking about. But to go further into not just gearing, but the general rewards philosophy, because not everything is about throughput. People don't only care about this game as a means to do big DPS. They care about their characters, and part of characters is things like visuals. Not everything needs to reward power. You can have tedious chores or prestigious activities that don't reward power. That is okay. That is fine. We realized this expansions ago with challenge modes, with the Mage Tower. You can have something that's a challenge and players want to do, and it doesn't need to reward power. If the Mage Tower was released in this game, it would give you a chance to upgrade your conduits or upgrade domination gems. And it doesn't need to. You can create something cool and interesting that doesn't make your character stronger, and people will do it just for the visuals, for the challenge. But if you're going to do this, you need to not do recolors. Prestige is only prestige if it's prestigious. Mage Tower was the perfect example here. There were recolors of the Mage Tower forms, or the Mage Tower weapons, but in order to use those recolors, you had to have the base. I think a huge issue with the game at the moment is everything is just recolor central. Touching on tier sets, going back, getting your tier set appearance from Mythic or Heroic or whatever was hype, that was prestigious. Other people wouldn't have that. That was cool, and maybe they could get it afterwards, and that was fine. Well, it's debatable whether that was fine, but at the time that was dope. Getting your full tier set transmog was a milestone. You were the coolest person in the playground, for want of a better word. But what we have now is things like, looking at this patch, there's the back attachments, like the cloak replacements that come from Torghast and the Maw. And those are cool, but they're not prestigious. And I think prestige is a huge part of aspirational gameplay. I don't. There's 1,000 recolors of those things. So if I get the recolor from the Adamant Vaults, from doing dope gameplay and performing well, who gives a shit? It's a slight tint on what I could have gotten from opening a random chest in Guiltyas or the Maw. I don't know about other people, but I got into high-end PvP and I got into mythic raiding because the cosmetics I got from that was fucking cool. It was prestigious, it was cool, and I was jealous of the people who got it. So I pushed myself to get involved in that content in order I could be that person. I could have this cool look. Whereas what we have now is I don't know if you've looked at the sets from the last two tiers, Castle Nathria and Sanctum of Domination, but it's not my spec. Some monk, some rogue gets the exact same look. It doesn't connect to my character as much, and there's minimal prestige. The difference in looks between the heroic or normal or LFR set and the mythic set for both of those is the most minute of particle effects. And I just didn't care about getting my elite set or my mythic set, because why bother? It wasn't prestigious, it wasn't interesting, it wasn't unique, it wasn't. I could get the same thing from running LFR weekly. So I think that really covers a lot of what I wanted to talk about. But to hit my final conclusions, Blizzard are missing out on the soul of what made artifacts and tier weapons so loved. And that was that it was interactive to your class. It was interactive to how you played the game. It made you think about the game and how you played and how you pressed buttons differently. And it was specific and interactive to our characters and our character's identity. What interests people with gearing is how that gear interacts with their character, with how it changes how they play, how they look, how it hits the fantasy of the spec they're playing. And you don't have to make every reward power. The reward for Adamant Vaults doesn't need to be conduits. Just make it harder, make it more prestigious, and make it reward something unique and cosmetic that makes me want to hunt it down just so I can look cooler. And when you do that, don't dilute it with recolors. Don't make it so that you're getting a tint. Make it something genuinely unique and something prestigious that people want to hunt down. I hope you enjoyed listening. I just really wanted to talk about this stuff. I was inspired by Magdalena, who wanted me to stream the other day and go through the issues I had with the current game. And I realized doing that this was something I wanted to talk about more and really touch in deeply, as opposed to mindlessly shouting into the void or complaining at whoever. Not going to name any names. But this is something that I really enjoy doing. So if this is something you've enjoyed listening to, please let me know. My socials are here. I stream infrequently. I tweet frequently. Let me know what you thought about this. And I'd be happy to discuss your thoughts on it. But if you've made it this far, thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I hope it's made you think about what has made you love this game. Because at the end of the day, we all love this game, and we all want it to be better. Salut, and have a good day.